You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Happy Monday evening, folks. Welcome to my program, the Intrepid radio program, with me, your host, Scotty Roberts, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com, and you can go over and find out all the locations where you can listen to this show audibly, all the different networks that pick it up and carry it. At the same time, you could come over to my YouTube channel and watch the video broadcast, the best part being the live chat room with all the Intrepids who gather to talk about this show and other things during the show, right here in the live chat room at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. All right, I hope you're all doing well this Monday. Hope we're drawing closer and closer to a possible reigniting of the United States economy, opening up some doors, still being safe at the same time. So there's all kinds of controversy about that, all kinds of talk. But I hope you're doing well in your sequestration and self-isolation. I know we hung out with our neighbors across the street yesterday for a little bit, them and their little kid, and he's been working through the whole thing. He's in some kind of construction position, and she's been doing daycare the whole time. And so they all abide by the safety rules and all of that. And so I know there's a lot of people out there eager to get things going back the way they were. And so even though there's going to be some changes and there's going to be obvious outcomes of having a pandemic, I do think we're going to survive this and we're going to get through it just fine. And I hope you haven't lost your sanity at home yet, but that you've enjoyed the time off. Just either being by yourself. Some people that could be a lonely time. Others, you might have enjoyed having the time off with your kids who are home from school. Ours won't go back to school until next August. Well, this coming August. And so I get you. I'm with you. I feel your pain. I also enjoy the ups and downs of it with you. We've had not a lot of change over here. Life hasn't changed too much, because both my wife and I work here at home all day anyway, and so going out has been about the only thing that's really been curtailed for us, and of course, having the kids home all day long. And in the summertime, it's different, as I've said before, because you can kick them outside. Now it's just starting to get warmed up outside, and we're starting to get good temperatures, and the kids can go run outside, so it's not even so bad at that. So I hope you're doing well through all of this. And I hope you're enjoying the shows. Today, we've got a pretty fun show in store for you. If you like history, if you like archaeology, if you like biblical archaeology. And when I say biblical archaeology, I'm not talking about it having a faith thrust to it. Biblical archaeology started as a means to explore all the historical events listed in the Bible and find out if there is actually historical backing, archaeological backing for those events. And there have been, at least I read this quite some time ago now, so I'm sure there's more, but at one point, at least 50 years ago, there had been 1,500 sites of history in the Bible explored with biblical archaeology and found to be accurate. And so now that's a blanket statement, of course. There's going to be all kinds of little facts that change. There's going to be embellishments in the text and things like that. It's like, just take the parting of the Red Sea. Did that event occur? the way the Bible says it does, the hand of God came down and parted the waters, and the Israelites passed through on dry ground. Is that an actual miraculous event? No way to prove that with archaeology. Is it a plausible event, given that there are different explanations for what this might have been? Remember last week I showed you this map, and those of you who are listening, you don't have the ability to see this, but let me throw this up. This map right here, we left off talking about this last week. If you see right smack in the middle of this map, it's a map for those just listening of northern Egypt. You see the Nile Delta, the green area, the Nile fan, they call it, up on the whole left upper side. And then you've got kind of right central at the bottom, the northern tip of the Red Sea, and the Sinai off to the left, and the Mediterranean Sea to the upper right. And you see that right smack in the middle is a place called the Wadi Tumilat. A wadi is a wash where at least once a year rainwater comes in there and washes through there. And you can see right above the words on the map, Wadi Tumilat, there's kind of a slight green arc, a slight green strip there. And that is the Wadi Tumilat. That is a fertile area where the wash comes through once a year, and of course vegetation grows there. And it goes from roughly the same place where you see on the map Pi-Ramesses or Goshen. This was the place where the Israelites dwelt. And it was off to the northeast, slightly northeast of what is present-day Cairo, and down below Cairo is Memphis, about 25 to 30 miles south of Cairo, right at the mouth of the Nile Delta. Memphis is this town, the city that was the northern capital of Egypt, the northern palaces and so on, while the rest of the year they were down in Luxor, and about 450, 500 miles to the south on the Nile. And so this map shows you the probable route taken by the Israelites, because the Wadi Tumilat was also part of the trade route. It was dry, 11 months out of the year, and this was used for a trade route, which got people over into the northern Sinai, and of course they spread out up to the north. It goes off the map up to the northeast to get up into Israel and Syria, Canaan, and all of those places. And so what I want you to see here at the Wadi Tumilat is where I believe the Israelites went from, logically, from the land of Goshen, or Pi-Ramesses was the city mentioned in the Bible. A couple of cities, actually. They were treasure cities of Ramesses II, who had rebuilt those treasure cities about 200 years later than the Exodus, on top of what they have discovered beneath the city of Avaris, which was very much a Semitic city. Lots of Israelite earmarks in that city, and that, I believe, was the slave city, if you will. That's the place where Joseph and his brothers from Canaan settled when they came over a few hundred years earlier. And so they took the Wadi Tumilat, and they ended up not at the great wide expanse of the Red Sea, but in what you see just above that northern tip of the Red Sea there, you see the Bitter Lakes. And there's the one big lake there, just below the T at the end of the word Wadi Tumilat. Just below the T, you see a big lake there, and it was called the Sea of Reeds. Now, I have mentioned this before, that coming off of the Negev, which is that lower region below Israel, it's upper from Sinai there, as the expanse goes up northeast of Sinai, there are winds that can come. They found a geologic event that is rare but takes place. These strong winds will blow off of the Negev, and they hit that. Let me show you the lake again here if you're looking. That's the wider one. Here we go. They blow onto this region called the Bitter Lakes and the Sea of Reeds. And geologically, it has been recorded it has had an effect to dry off the lake in certain areas. These strong east winds will blow, and in a day it will reveal dry ground or the lake bottom, because it's a very shallow lake. And it's possible, this is a speculation, that the Israelites, when coming to the Sea of Reeds, which was a mistranslation in the Old Testament from the Hebrew, to the Sea of Reeds, not the Red Sea, that the Sea of Reeds was dried up in portions because of these strong winds that blew. And they crossed over the Sea of Reeds, and as you can see on the map one more time, they crossed that sea area, that region, and they went down south along the shore of the Red Sea for about 40 to 50 miles, and then crossed inland to what I believe was the site of Mount Sinai. The early site of it was Serepet el Chedim, where I've been, and I've seen that place. Now, the reason I bring this up is to say that the Israelites, I believe that this event of the crossing of the Red Sea may have been a geologic event, and that Moses, more than anything, was an opportunist at the time. And I think a lot of what happened to them were they could have traveled around the lake and gone down, but they were able to travel across on relatively dry ground because of these winds. Now, if you remember the biblical passage, and we've mentioned this in the past when we studied this earlier, it says Moses, when they were up against the Red Sea, and Pharaoh's armies were coming to reclaim the slaves who are now gone, that it says, and Moses stretched the rod over the Red Sea, and the waters parted. But the passage says this, and we miss this sometimes. It says, when Moses stretched the rod and said to see the power of God over the waters, it said, and a strong east wind blew all night and parted the waters, as a wall on the left and a wall on the right. Now, mind you, a wall doesn't always have to be 20 feet tall. A wall, you can have, like shepherding walls that were 2 and 3 feet tall. So all it says is that a strong east wind blew all night. Now, it's that geologic event that takes place once in a while, where you have the strong east winds will blow off the Negev and really, in essence, dry the waters up, part the waters a bit, and leave dry ground. Is this what happened? Or was it just a miraculous power, the miraculous power of God? We don't know for sure. All we know is that there are some explanations that could explain this event. And when the waters close back up, when the wind stops, the waters have a almost miraculous response of closing back up very quickly. And this could account for Pharaoh's chariots being lost in the sea. And so, take that or leave it. There's that. And so with the Exodus, we started looking at the plausibility of some of the cities that existed and the dating of those cities. For instance, we talked about Jericho. Remember, the Israelites, they left Egypt. They made it in a couple of weeks to where Moses sent spies into the land of Canaan to check out the land, see what's going on there, what kind of people are dwelling there. And of course, they found people, and they ended up wandering as nomadic tribe through the desert in the Sinai for about 40 years, or about a generation, as that was called. And there was, of course, biblical events put on top of that, faith events, that God told them they couldn't enter the land, and so I'm sure some people filtered off and went anyway. There was the one tribe that broke off from Moses, and they went north of Israel into the Lebanon area. And there is some theorizing that they intermingled with the remnants of the tribe of the Anunnaki. And this is where you start getting the whole westward spread then of those people into the Anunnaki, spreading into what is now Europe and European culture. It gets into the whole reptilian thing, which is not what we're talking about today. But I thought I'd throw that in for free. So you've got Moses and the tribes of Israel wandering through the desert for 40 years. And then after Moses' death, Joshua takes the people and leads their armies against the city of Jericho. And as we mentioned last Friday, Jericho, the destruction at Tel Sultan, which is the mound of ancient Jericho, the ruins of ancient Jericho, which were excavated over 100 years ago, that those ruins date back to about 1405 BCE. Now, if the city was ruined in 1405 BC, destroyed, some say it was an earthquake, others because all the walls are broken down, broken outward from the city. Is this, again, a miraculous event they're talking about with God made the walls tumble down? Or is this a natural event that occurred there, leveling the city, and the Israelites took advantage of that? Whatever it might be, the date of that destruction of Jericho is right around 1405 BCE. Now, and by the way, the city of Jericho was uninhabited for almost 800 years after that, which would place it around the 600s before the city rose up again. Now, in dating the Exodus, we're going to get into that today a little bit from a different angle than I've presented it before. In dating the Exodus, there are people that place it during the reign of Ramesses II. Well, if Ramesses II was the pharaoh of the Exodus, he lived in the mid-1200s BCE, which is about 150 years after the destruction of Jericho. If the biblical account is true, if it has some remnants of factual dating information, and if Joshua indeed led the armies of Israel to destroy Jericho, and it happened 40 years after the Exodus, according to the biblical account, how could that then Pharaoh Ramesses II, nearly 200 years later, be the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Especially since Jericho, if the conquest of Canaan took place afterwards and Jericho was destroyed, couldn't have been destroyed under his reign. It was destroyed 150 years before he was even born. And so this is one of the ways of looking at surrounding archaeological evidence to try to place a date. So they've worked very hard at redating the Exodus, and among biblical scholars and archaeologists, it's almost axiomatic that the Israelites entered Canaan about 1230 to 1220 BCE. And so in terms of archaeological periods, this would be toward the end of the Late Bronze Age, for which the generally accepted date, let's call that the GAD, is 1550 to 1200 BCE. So there's a lot of scholars that over the years placed the Exodus under Ramesses II because he's mentioned prominently in the book of Exodus that Ramesses II built his treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses during this time. Well, what they actually built, the Hebrews, was the city of Avaris. And Ramesses II rebuilt those cities almost 200 years later on top of the ruins of Avaris, which have been discovered beneath Pi-Ramesses. So there's enormous problems with the dating being in the mid-1200s BCE as the date for the Exodus. And in recent decades, an increasing number of scholars have recognized that if we accept the generally accepted date, the GAD of 1230 to 1220 BCE, for the Israelite entry into Canaan, we have to reject the biblical account of Israel's conquest of Canaanite cities. And this is because the biblical account conflicts so strongly with the archaeological record. And the Bible describes the Israelite conquest of Canaan at length, and it refers to a number of cities that were encountered by Joshua and his armies. And in almost every case, the archaeological evidence is inconsistent with the biblical evidence if we date the Israelite entry into Canaan to the GAD of 1230 to 1220 BCE. None of those cities existed at that time. So Jericho was the first city encountered by Joshua, as we mentioned already. And the Israelites, when they crossed the Jordan, encountered Jericho. According to the Bible, the Israelites conquered and destroyed Jericho, but according to the archaeologists, and the site's been very extensively excavated over the last century, there was no city at Jericho in 1230 to 1220 BCE for the Israelites to even think about destroying. The city didn't exist in that time period. And indeed, there's been no trace of occupation at Jericho that's even been found between about 1300 BCE and the 11th century BCE. Remember, we're dating backwards, going down as we get toward zero in the birth of Jesus. So the probable date of the earliest Iron Age remains. But Ai, or Ai is the way it's spelled, Ai, was the next city on the Israelite route, and the Bible gives a detailed account of the Battle of Ai that led to the city's destruction. That's in Joshua 7 and 8, the book of Joshua in the Old Testament. And despite extensive excavations at the site commonly identified as Ai, the archaeologists have discovered no evidence of occupation between about 2400 and 1200 BC. And about 1200 BC, a small unwalled village grew up on the site, lasting until about 1050 BCE. So now, I'm giving you dates and stuff like that, but remember, keep in mind as we do this, history is fun. Archaeology is fun. And when you start doing the math and you start looking at these dates and you start looking at the archaeology, you find out this is how you decipher when you're taking a biblical story. You want to make sure it matches historical fact. You don't want to try to squeeze historical fact into matching a faith story. And that's one of the dangers that has been done. So you have to step outside the box of the biblical tale and find out, is there efficacious historical events that match? And that's what we're doing here. Now at Gibeon, the city of Gibeon, whose people Joshua made a treaty with, according to the Bible, in Joshua 9, there is no late Bronze Age city has been found. James B. Pritchard, Gibeon's excavator, commented that the anomalies encountered at Jericho, Ai, and Gibeon suggest that we've reached an impasse on the question of supporting the traditional view of the conquest with archaeological undergirding. So when you start looking at the facts archaeologically, historically, they don't match up to the biblical account of the Exodus. But is the story true? But keep in mind, we're talking about the biblical story with the generally accepted date of Ramesses II being the pharaoh. This is the sticking point. Was the Exodus, did it occur under Ramesses II? Or did it occur a couple of hundred years earlier? This is just the beginning of this. The Bible tells us that Joshua gave the city of Hebron to Caleb at the time of the conquest. This is in Joshua 14. It's also, again, you find it in Judges 1. Now at Hebron, excavations in the 1960s, so we're talking 55 years ago, produced only scanty remains from between the end of the Middle Bronze Age, which is about 1550 BCE, and a late phase of Iron Age 1, which is the 11th century BCE, and no evidence of occupation in the 13th century BCE, which would be the 1200s. So what's interesting, what's starting to emerge with all these cities is this archaeological data that does not match up to the generally accepted date of the Exodus. The city of Hormah or Zapheth figures as a flourishing town at the time of the conquest. That's in the book of Numbers 21, Judges 1. Yet excavations at the site, thought to be Horem and Zapheth, or Tel Mesos as it's referred, have revealed a fortification from the Middle Bronze II period, which is 1900 to 1550 BCE, and an Iron Age 12th century BCE settlement, but no intervening occupation. So on their march to Canaan, the Israelites were opposed by the king of Arad, and that's Numbers 22, and again in Numbers 33. Yet Tel Arad was abandoned from the end of the early Bronze Age, the 3rd millennium BCE, until the Iron Age. So no late Bronze Age settlement was found. The late Professor Yohanan Arhoni's suggestion that Canaanite Arad lay at Tel Malhata, about 8 miles to the southwest of Tel Arad, does nothing to solve the problem. For there's no evidence of a settlement between the end of the Middle Bronze Age and Iron Age 2. So we got to leave it hanging right there. Just a cliffhanger till the next segment. Folks, sit tight. We'll be back in about 2 minutes. All right, folks, welcome back from the break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Go find out all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. You can also listen to this broadcast in simulcast, in video, over on my YouTube channel, and join the other Intrepids in the live chat room going on right now as you're hearing this. So you come on over to youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, we left off at the end of the first segment talking about all these cities that could not possibly have existed during the generally accepted date of the Exodus, which was in the 1220s BCE. We're starting to get a picture that it may have taken place much earlier than that. Now, I talked about the cities of Hora and Zapheth is where we left off. And so talked about how on their march to Canaan, the Israelites were opposed by the king of Arad, which is Numbers 22 in the Bible. And we talked about how Yohanan Aharoni's suggestion that Canaanite Arad lay in a different place, about 8 miles to the southeast. But that still doesn't solve the problem, because there was no evidence of a settlement between the end of the Middle Bronze Age, 1550 BCE, and the Iron Age 2 to the 10th century BC. So thus, at 6 sites that we covered in the first segment that figure in the biblical account of the conquest under Joshua after the death of Moses, after the Exodus, after the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, we have little or no evidence of the late Bronze Age occupation. What we have is 6 cities that frankly did not exist at the time to which Joshua is conveniently assigned. And there's further problems to this. Debir, D-E-B-I-R, one of the cities conquered by Israel, you find this in the book of Joshua 10 and Joshua 15 and also in Judges 1, is now almost certainly to be identified with Kirbit Rabud, as Moshe Kokavi argues, rather than with Tel Beret Mirishim, as William Albright once urged. These are archaeologists and biblical historians. And while there was certainly an important late Bronze Age town on the site, there's no evidence for its conquest in the late 13th century BCE, which is the 1200s. Now at Lachish, another town taken by the Israelites, you find this in Joshua chapter 10, there was indeed a destruction at the end of the late Bronze Age, which Albright dated to about 1230 to 1220 BCE, and he attributed the Israelite invaders to its destruction. However, recent excavations have led the excavator, David Usishkin, to redate this destruction to about 1150 BCE or even slightly later. So the end of the late Bronze Age, Lachish, can no longer be treated as evidence for a conquest by Israel in the late 13th century. Even this does not exhaust the list of cities mentioned in the conquest traditions, but the remainder can't be discussed profitably here at this time because either the identification is uncertain or because there's not yet been adequate excavation. But even if one of the remaining sites produced a perfect match with the traditions, there would still be more problem cities for a 13th century conquest than good correlations with the biblical narratives. And of the various cities said to have been conquered by the Israelites in the book of Joshua and Judges, only Hatzor and Bethel, which is referred to as Beitin, have destruction levels datable to the second half of the 13th century BCE. And so two destroyed cities hardly amount to evidence for a conquest, especially when there's no evidence that their attackers were the Israelites. And these destructions may have resulted from any one of a number of other causes. For example, Egyptian campaigns, which took place all the way through the early period of Israel and Canaan, post-Exodus, or local intercity warfare, which took place all the time in Canaan. So this admittedly poor fit between biblical tradition and archaeological evidence is universally recognized by scholars, the majority of whom nevertheless adapt a date of, or accept a date of 1230 to 1220 for Israel's entry into Canaan. So, how do you deal with this problem when the biblical story, the events listed there, don't match historical evidence? But what if they do? What if we've just got the dates wrong? What if you move the whole kit and caboodle back a couple of hundred years? One approach which has gained considerable support in mainstream scholarship is to explain Israel's emergence in Canaan by processes other than conquest, that is, by thoroughly rejecting the biblical account. Among these alternative views is the peaceful infiltration theory, which was long favored by German scholars. Another newer proposal is the peasant revolt, a theory advocated by George Mendenhall and Norman Gottwald. And according to this, what the Bible describes in terms of an Israelite conquest was in fact a revolt of local peasants against the urban centers that previously dominated them. Now there's something, I've referred to this in John Ward, when we wrote our book on the Exodus, I always jokingly called him a biblical minimalist. Oh, you're such a minimalist. And there are biblical minimalists, those that look at the Bible as only a faith story rather than an actual account of historical events that took place around which the faith story was wrapped. So there is a better solution than these what biblical minimalists offer up, the peasants' revolt and things like that. One that does more justice to the biblical traditions, which I am going to present to you today. I've presented this before, but here's just a slightly different take on it as I read more materials and see what other archaeologists and historians have put forward. The solution requires us to make two radical chronological adjustments, which I'm going to discuss with you right now. The first is simple. I've already mentioned this. Move the date of the conquest back about 200 years to shortly before 1400 BCE. And although this conflicts with the generally accepted date for Israel's emergence into Canaan and the Exodus under Ramesses II, it is in fact the date implied by the Bible itself. Now, I've talked about this before. If you have a Bible handy, look up 1 Kings 6:1. As a matter of fact, I'm going to find that for you right now. Let's go to 1 Kings 6:1 and see exactly what it says. Here's what it says. Here's 1 Kings 6:1. Sorry for the stumbling. In the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon the king's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. And then it goes into a description of the construction of the temple. So it's saying in 1 Kings 6:1, it's telling you that according to 1 Kings 6:1, Solomon began building the great temple in the 4th year of his reign, and that this was 480 years after the Exodus. So Solomon's reign can be dated with considerable confidence to about 971 to 931 BCE, so the mid-10th century. So the 4th year of his reign would be 967 BC. And according to the biblical chronology, this would place the Exodus 480 years earlier, at about 1447 BCE. This is the date. I've always said 1446 is the date I have given the Exodus in our book and in my theories. And it's because of this key swing date, or hinge pin date, in the Old Testament of 1 Kings 6:1. About 1450 BC for convenience. If you fudge a little bit, you can say historically and archaeologically speaking, the Exodus took place roughly around 1450 BCE, give or take a couple of years in either direction. So if we allow the 40 years for the desert wanderings, the nomadic time in the wilderness after the Exodus, before the conquest of Canaan, we arrive at a date of about 1410 to 1400 BCE for the Israelite entry into Canaan. And this is almost 200 years earlier than the generally accepted date of 1230 to 1220, which of course was based on the fact that Ramses was said to have built his treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses that were built originally by the Israelites when they were enslaved in Egypt, which we have come to find was actually the city of Avaris beneath Pi-Ramesses, and that Ramesses II, a couple of hundred years later, rebuilt those cities as his treasure cities, which is what Ramesses II was wont to do. He reclaimed a lot of cities and a lot of structures, a lot of places where he put his inscription, scraped off the old, put his on, took old cities, rebuilt them, beautified them. So another biblical text, Judges 11, verse 26, indicates that the Israelites had been settled in Transjordan for 300 years by the time of Japheth, one of the judges in the pre-King David, pre the monarchy in Israel, post-Exodus, that they had been there for about 300 years. And by common agreement, it can be dated about 1100 BCE. And this would place Israelite settlement east of the Jordan 300 years earlier, about 1400 BCE. Again, almost 200 years before the generally accepted date based on the Ramesses II passages in the Bible. So admittedly, the figure of 480 years used in 1 Kings and the 300 years used in Judges sound like approximations. We could say right now the United States was founded by our founders about 250 years ago. That's the same kind of thing. Now, if you get an exact date, it's different than that. So, but that's the approximate figure that's put on there. This is what's happening in the biblical text. And keep in mind, the biblical books we have of Moses, which detail these events of the conquest, give these and later the book of Kings, which gives the date of 480 years before the fourth year of the reign of Solomon, when he started building the temple, was the date of the Exodus. That's a pretty round number. So they're probably being given in round numbers. And keep in mind, these books were all reconstructed about 1,000 years after Moses wrote his books, and about 500 years after Joshua wrote his book. They were all reconstructed after the Babylonian invasion and conquest of Israel. And when the people were freed, they went back. I've mentioned this before, the 72 rabbis who went to the Library of Alexandria in about the 400s BCE, asked permission of Pharaoh Ptolemy II to go in and reconstruct their scriptures and their history based on scrolls and things they found at the library. And so many of these dates were approximations in the rewrite, which is what we have in the Old Testament now as the Old Testament. The Septuagint is what they came up, the Septuaginta, some would say. And that was the rewrite, using all they could remember and all they could find in the Library of Alexandria. And so the figure 480 is especially suspect. It's 12 times 40, a frequently used figure in the Bible, 40. 40 was the number of judgment. 12 was the number of tribes of Israel. And so, and I've postulated this before, is this perhaps a round date just based on numbers that had meaning already? But you got to doubt whether these figures should be dismissed as absolutely meaningless, as they've been by most critical scholars. And we're going to show in the rest of this material I'm presenting to you, which we're not even going to get through tonight, that the reasons why the scholars originally preferred the generally accepted date, the GAD, to the biblical chronology, have all been undermined in recent years. In view of this, it's reasonable to take up biblical chronology once more as a working hypothesis. In other words, to test it against the non-biblical evidence to see how it fares. If the GAD for Israel's conquest of Canaan provides such a poor fit between the biblical account and the archaeological record, how did the 1230 to 1220 BCE become the GAD in the first place? How did that become the generally accepted date when the fit is so poor? The answer is tied up with the dating of the Exodus, because the GAD of the conquest is linked with the GAD for the Exodus, and we need to understand how these dates were determined. Now, since the early decades of this century, of the 20th century, the three main arguments have been built up for dating the Exodus to the 13th century BCE under Ramesses II. And let's examine those in turn. We're told in Exodus 1:11 that the Israelites enslaved in Egypt built for Pharaoh store cities of Pithom and Ramses. Now that's right there in Exodus 1:11. And the statement's been used to date the Exodus in two ways. First, the very name Ramses in Pi-Ramesses, Pithom and Ramses, recalls the Egyptian name Ramses, born by one of Egypt's most illustrious pharaohs, Ramses II, or Ramses the Great, who reigned from 1290 BCE to 1224 BCE, or, depending on the dating system you use of the chronology of the Egyptian kings, 1279 to 1213. So this pharaoh did indeed build a royal residence city called Pi-Ramesses in the eastern Nile Delta. Exodus 1:11 has therefore been taken to indicate that the Israelites cannot have left Egypt before the reign of Ramses II in the 12th century, or the 1200s BCE. However, the Bible doesn't use the name Ramses with chronological rigor. as it's evident from its use in Genesis 47:11, just the couple of chapters in the book of Genesis before we hit Exodus. And in this verse, the name spelled Ramesses, that's Rameses, is used to describe the region in the delta in which the patriarch Jacob and his sons settled under Joseph, who had been, you know, the story of Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, how his brothers sold him into slavery, and he ended up being risen to great power over the next 20 years by the pharaoh in Egypt at that time. And it's this man, this grand vizier, that his brothers, according to the story, the sons of Jacob, encountered when they wanted to settle in the Nile Delta region. And that's a whole story all unto itself that has some great, amazing historical underpinnings. And maybe we'll get to that. Not today, but we'll get into that story again. Now, since no scholar dates the original Hebrew settlement in Egypt as late as the 13th century, it's acknowledged that here a name in common use for the area at the time is being used retrospectively, just as a modern historian might write of Julius Caesar crossing the English Channel. No English Channel existed at the time of Julius Caesar. It was called something else. But we say Julius Caesar crossed the English Channel. It's the same way we speak of New York. The city of New York was founded by, New York is the British name for the city. But it was originally called New Amsterdam because it was founded by the Dutch. So the different name places and the changing. So the same explanation may apply to the use of Ramses in Exodus 1:11. They're talking about the cities that he built because they're not referencing the much older name of Avaris, which was built by the Israelites in Egypt. So is there evidence that building activity went on at the site of Ramses at an earlier time than the reign of Ramses II? Yes! Yes, there is. Though this evidence does not prove that work was going on around 1450 BCE, the biblical date for the Exodus, the evidence of earlier occupation at Pi-Ramesses dates to the 19th and 17th centuries BCE. This was when a major administrative center was first developed on the site. And archaeologists have been unearthing the long history of this important city since the 1930s. It lies in the Katna-Kantir district of Egypt's eastern delta, in the region of Goshen, where the Israelites initially settled. It's Genesis 47 to find that. Indeed, the culture excavated from this earlier period beneath Pi-Ramesses has a strong Syrio-Palestinian Canaanite element to it, closely resembling that of contemporaneous Canaan, the Middle Bronze II period. And we suggest that this reflects the migration of Canaanite groups, including the Israelites, into Egypt. Groups that were subsequently pressed into slavery to work on the sites of Pithom and Ramses, quote unquote. In other words, you have to associate the building of these two cities with the beginning of Israelites' enslavement, not with the eve of the Exodus several centuries later. And Pithom and Ramses, by the way, was the cities renamed after they were rebuilt. And now you have to turn to the evidence regarding Pithom. There are two possible sites for biblical Pithom, and that's at Tel El Maskuta and Tel El Retaba. And these two sites lie about 8 miles apart in the Wadi Tumalat. Remember the Wadi Tumalat on our map? West of Lake Timsah, which is, again, that Sea of Reeds, that Bitter Lakes region. And we need not debate which of the two should be identified with Pithom. The important point is this. The same Syrio-Canaanite Middle Bronze II culture, which marks the early period of the site of Ramesses, has now been found at both these candidates for Pithom as well. At Tel El Maskuta, the site favored for Pithom by a majority of scholars, the early remains include probable grain storage facilities, perhaps explaining the term store cities of Pharaoh. And so the archaeologists and the Egyptologists have traditionally held a different view of this Syrio-Canaanite culture in the eastern delta of Egypt. They associate it with the forerunners of the Hyksos, a Semitic people from somewhere in the Syria Canaanite region, which the ancient Egyptians referred to them all as Asiatics, took over the throne of Egypt in the north around 1650 BCE. And they ruled the land for about 100 years, 108 years to be exact. And there may be a lot of truth in this, but it's also plausible to suggest that there were other Semites among the new settlers in the region. Not just the family of Jacob, which was about 70 people under Joseph, and as well as the ancestors of the later Hyksos. There's indeed evidence from Tel El Maskuta that some Semitic settlers were treated with brutality by the Hyksos. The Middle Bronze finds at Tel El Maskuta include the tomb of a woman and her dog, both killed by blows from a type of battle axe used by the Hyksos peoples. And we suggest that these other Semitic settlers were, or at least included, the Israelites, whom the Hyksos treated as slaves, perhaps following an example already set by Egyptians. I have a little different theory on this myself, and we've only got a couple of minutes left, but remember in the biblical account, when Joseph had been raised to power by a Hyksos king, the time period fits. And I started establishing why I believe it were the Hyksos that were there when the family of Jacob came into the Nile Delta during the drought in Canaan. Joseph, who was the grand vizier, says to all his brothers, now, when you go into Pharaoh to present your case for moving into the Delta to get his permission, tell him, this is in the biblical account, by the way, in the end of the book of Genesis, he said, tell them you are shepherds and that you've been shepherds from the days of your youth, because the Egyptians hate shepherds. And I thought, how are you going to win the favor of the Pharaoh if you're going to tell him that you're the kind of people that they despise? Well, that's more probably, that little phrase tells us more about whom Joseph was serving under, because the Hyksos were Asiatic peoples themselves, that for 800 years had been filtering into the Nile Delta and all the cities, and they eventually took over the northern capital and established their own pharaonic dynasty for about 100 years. The Hyksos, they were all, the original word meant shepherding peoples. They were peoples from the Asiatic region, just like Joseph and his brothers. And the Egyptians, the real Egyptians, if you will, by blood, were in the south, in Luxor, 500 miles to the south, reigning in the southern kingdom. The Hyksos were in the north. And when Joseph says, tell him that you're shepherds and you've been shepherds since the days of your youth because the Egyptians hate shepherds, he's talking about the Egyptians to the south, who are the enemies to the Hyksos in the north. He says, tell them, we're brothers, we're cousins, we all come from the same place. And this is how Joseph tells them to win the favor of the Pharaoh. Tell them who you are and the kind of people you are, and there's going to be a blood linkage there. And then remember, after the death of Joseph, it says about another generation or so passes, and a new Pharaoh came to the throne who knew not Joseph, had no regard for Joseph. No regard for the shepherding people, no regard for the Hyksos. That would have been none other than Amos the first. Amos, or Moses, Moshe. He was the Pharaoh who came in and cleared the Hyksos out of the north, totally destroyed them, drove them out, and enslaved the remnant of those people. And this was a guy who had no regard for Joseph. And this is when the enslavement happened. And so, all of this builds into the city of Avaris, where they've also discovered a palace that matches the description of Joseph's palace in the Canaanite settlement. So we're going to hit this more tomorrow. Folks, thanks for listening. We're out of time tonight. Isn't this exciting stuff? Come back tomorrow. See if we can have more pictures for tomorrow, too, for those of you watching on the video stream. So thanks for being here. Have a good night. See you in 23 hours.